So we're here again to do another sculpture forum. We've been to see the Bertoldo di Giovanni show at the Frick, and I'm here with
Gagnier, a sculptor, teacher.
Karen Wilkin, curator, critic.
Jock, Ireland, sculptor, teacher.
with Maud behind the camera as usual. Thank you, Maud. So this show, which I have to confess, I was not aware of Bertoldo's existence and work until this show. My attention was drawn to this show, and I guess it's understandable. He's not a big name. He didn't live for very long. He lived in 1440 to 1491. And the show is a small show. It consists of just 22 works and only 7 freestanding sculptures. The rest are reliefs and medals. But I'm eager to hear what you all thought. I really. I was really struck. It was absolutely wonderful, gorgeous, and personal, extraordinary that this work should have such a sense of intimacy to me. So what did anybody else think?
A footnote to what you just said, Garth. It's a small show, but it's almost all of the known work of Bertoldo di Giovanni. Who's known really as a name. I mean, it's like Stephen Green is always, the painter Stephen Green is always talked about as the student of Guston and the teacher of Frank Stella, when in fact he's an extraordinary painter in his own right. And you run across Bertoldo, if you're doing any work on the Renaissance, as the student of Donatello and the mentor of Michelangelo.
Mm-hmm.
And you read he was Lorenzo de' Medici's favorite sculptor. You see the show, you see why.
Yeah. No, I meant to say that the show contained, these 22 works were pretty much all that is reasonably authenticated as works by Bertoldo.
I went to the exhibition expecting to meet an artist who I had tried to do some research on previously and could find almost nothing. I expected to find an artist with a very consolidated grasp of the patterns of how to put together animals and humans, anatomical patterns that you might see in somebody like Giambologna. But I should have known better, given that he was in the very rich soup of the Quattrocento. So I was unprepared for the variety of the stylistic variety that I encountered, which made it much more interesting for me. Every time I tried to get a grip on a singular synthesis of what all the things that were going on, then I was confronted with a very different influence. There were times when I saw some Greco-Roman things that I could relate to the Pisanos. There were times when I saw things that were almost Etruscan, that were Romanesque and influenced that. At a certain moment, I thought I saw Botticelli a little bit in the background of one. And there were some Gothic influences. It was very interesting how he moved between these things.
Yeah, I'm sure everything you say is the case, because but through all of it, they came across to me, a sense of a real person.
Yeah.
No matter what the influence there was, I just felt I kind of had a sense of who this guy was.
I agree with that very much. And you certainly saw him going toe-to-toe with the classical past. But what I found so fascinating was the commonalities that I found. And there was a fascination with playing complicated textures and three-dimensional patterns against, excuse me, very suavely modeled forms. And what really struck me in both the Bellerophon and the Hercules, from the end views, how complex the way this moved in space and the way things were moving in opposite directions. In the Bellerophon, the legs of the horse, the arms of Bellerophon, the head of the horse, everything is carving out a different trajectory in space. And I found that really exciting.
Yeah, I was thrilled. I mean, the other thing, I mean, and this may be totally nuts, but I felt the guy was having fun.
Well, I think the owners were having fun too, because they got to handle these things.
Yeah.
And they could feel the difference between the garland on a hip and the curve of the horse's flank.
Yeah. That battle scene, that battle relief is astonishing, isn't it? It's just, yeah, it's almost like looking at a Jackson Pollock crit painting. It's amazing.
Yes, it has the serial quality that you see in some of the reliefs of Nicola Pisano.
Mm-hmm.
What surprised me, which we're viewing right now, is how he brought the focal point out into the foreground. I was thinking as I was looking at that is quite odd, but at the same time I was thinking how he really never quite got involved with the depth of overlaps and so on that Donatello got to in his own lifetime. That they're not even at the stage of Ghiberti in adapting to the new Renaissance ideas of space.
Well, they're earlier.
Earlier.
But and that certainly is true. There were a couple of other reliefs that are much shallower and very linear and
Yeah.
fabulous drawing.
Yes.
But they're certainly not three-dimensional in any way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, the ceramic frieze, according to the label, they've identified, 5 or 7 people that worked with him
Yes.
on it.
I felt that the ceramic frieze might have been different for me in the feeling because of the fact that it might have been modeled in clay, whereas most of them were modeled in wax.
Yeah.
And it was in the ones that were made in wax, it was fascinating to see exactly what techniques he was using. One of them had, it was described as being part of the chiseling into the bronze, but I think that it was more likely the technique that they used with the wax of putting on a lot of wax and then moving into it with a hot tool or a chisel.
Mm-hmm.
And why he left it that way, that was in the Orpheus, yeah, was very interesting.
Well, the explanation, and talking about this with the curator, they're pretty certain that it's not some kind of proto-expressionism, that he just didn't bother to finish it because of the cracks.
Yeah.
There was no point. I mean, to read it as an aesthetic choice, I think that's a little problematic.
There are some later reliefs of Donatello where that's left across the whole surface. They're really roughed in.
And the Michelangelo leaving the rough stone, but this is different.
Yeah.
Jock, you were going to say something.
Well, about that Orpheus, it's really wonderful that we've got it. It's 500 or 600 years old, and full of cracks, unfinished. Why didn't somebody turn it into a cannonball? Mm-hmm. And it stands out, and it stands out as something that talks to us directly in a way that other show. I remember an Antico show at the Frick, and Rizzo or Rizzi, or another show of small bronzes that I just couldn't connect with.
There was a rough spot in the top of the head also of Orpheus that looked like either leftover material or something they had done in as they attached the bronze, or maybe later on. That was, those things have appeal to modern sensibility.
Yeah, that sense of this is how the thing was made.
Yeah.
That was available to us in a way that we as 20th, 21st century people can, we can touch. It's real to us.
Some of the torque of the contrapposto is really quite strong and very well understood. But then occasionally, if you peer from exactly the side or exactly the front, you realize, like here in this view, that they're almost rectangular. The spiral disappears into the rectangle. I've seen it in Matisse, for instance, in those lying down figures also, and that surprised me then as well. That if you look at this horse from exactly the front, you're really looking at a flat plane all the way down to the back.
But I'm just so struck by the way the legs of the horse and the man create that volume of space, and the arms do something else. It just, wow. The fact that one leg's a little in front of the other.
Do you think that he had access to, say, the Pisanos in Pisa or Siena? I mean, I don't even know if Donatello is so little known.
But he got, certainly for the battle relief, there's, in the catalog, talk about his getting, it's being based on a Roman sarcophagus.
Oh, yeah.
And the Pisanos did the same sort of thing. I went to see the show with a dance critic friend, and then I talked or emailed to another dance critic, and jokingly or whatever, Mindy Aloff said that that battle relief came out of a Paul Taylor dance, and she said it was Last Look, and Marina Hars said it was Promethean Fire, and then Mindy, the supplicant, the little figure in the back row, she said that's a Jose Limon figure, and I don't know, that was another way of bringing this Renaissance work into the 20th, 21st century.
Yeah, well, it does speak to the sense I have that this work is very present and in some way feels surprisingly relevant.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I think what you said before about his personality coming through, because I was thinking about Donatello as I looked at this show and how Donatello could move anatomical patterns from the past into a new abstraction. After you said that, Garth, I realized I too felt a unique personality in the way he took what are maybe not normalized forms, but available forms, anatomical forms, and he moved them into personality. He moved them into his own. And they feel innocent in some way.
Yes, I think that was a word I also had in mind. It was a kind of innocence. What about this polychrome figure that's almost kind of Germanic, almost?
I think you're right, Garth. It has some Northern Gothic in it, and there's a linearity to a sinewiness to the forms that is not as personalized in it. It's hard for me to not think of the Mary Magdalene at the same time, just not because it's so similar, and of course they did say at one time Donatello had made this. It's similar, but it's very different. One thing is just the craft of it, to me, is very different. Some of the gesso work in the Donatello gets up to an inch or an inch and a half thick. But this seems very refined, and the gesso is very thin and seems tight against a very refined carving, whereas you can see the carving underneath the Donatello was so rough. Another thing that struck me, and I was speaking to Karen about, is the complete personalization of the proportions of the figure. The legs seem twice as long as any cannon. The arms, the hands, the feet are all in different measurements, but all
feet are fabulous.
but all harmonious, which shows that, you know, he was very aware of the idea of harmony, proportion, and beauty of some way. He was making it up abstractly, I think.
There's a wonderful book by a Dutch historian called The Waning of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
That man called Houtzinger. And he uses the metaphor of a tide coming in, waves breaking on a beach as a metaphor for the Renaissance. That it wasn't, you know, a turning of a wheel where things changed, but some things went higher up on the shore and some things not so high, and eventually the tide came in. You know, I mean, one of the things that I find so fascinating and moving about Donatello, and in these, as you say, are these threads of Gothic that are still very visible, even though these are people that are attempting to go toe-to-toe with the classical inheritance. And it's that tension between them that I think makes the work so fascinating.
How they each came out of that is rather beautiful, really, because as artists, they both came out quite differently. Donatello can be one of the greatest narrative poets who ever lived, and this guy comes out much more like us today, as Garth was suggesting, I think.
Well, the other thing that kind of, you know, made it seem kind of contemporary in a way was the extent to which the subject, in many cases, didn't seem all that absolutely clear. You know, often there's some ambiguity about exactly what the subject was, other than the crucifixion reliefs. And
is that not absolutely clear to us? Might it have been absolutely clear to a Quattrocento audience?
That's a very real question, and I don't know the answer. You know, we don't know the answer. But the fact that you know, that to us it was not, we were not able to, you know, and I imagine, you know, not that I know for sure, but I imagine that scholars have puzzled over this, and in most cases are able to determine, you know, with some precision what the subject was. But that sense of there being some ambiguity about just what the subject matter was seemed to me to be something that opened it up for me in a way.
I think that you can feel that he got involved at that time with some of the vagaries of reality that some of the other sculptors had gotten involved with. You know, that there's suddenly into the mix of Byzantine and Gothic and Greco-Roman comes this sense of using a model or a real person being there. I mean, St. Jerome looks like somebody off the street almost.
Right, and it is, you know, it was recently restored, and so it's you know, it's partly a Renaissance sculpture and partly a 21st century sculpture. But the big connection in it, and what, you know, when you talk about his working from life, is Peter Agostini. This
Peter was so involved with Donatello.
And probably had never heard of Bertoldo. And that sense of Peter being a sort of Stephen Green-like figure. But I could see it in the little figure, particularly the tiny the range of size, you know, the little tiny figures on the medallions,
Yeah.
and then the St. Jerome is, and the sort of relaxed way he moved from tiny to almost life size was wonderful and accessible. I could sort of feel him working.
Because there could have been more in between that we don't have.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, there could have been. We just don't know, do we? I mean, it seems surprising that although he didn't live for very long, he was 50, 51 or
That
something.
was pretty respectable in the Quattrocento.
In those days, yes, that's true.
This is going to sound very rude, but how useful is it to keep saying, well, this reminds me of Jose Limon. What does that tell you about the sculpture? It means that the person who's looking at it knows more about Jose Limon than about Bertoldo, and it's possible that Jose Limon was looking at Renaissance bronzes. Does it really tell us anything about the sculpture?
Well, yeah, I think it does. It tells us about the content, it's that sort of emotional richness, that dimension, that the personality that Garth is talking about, that you can feel in that relief that went around the room. It's almost a Kentridge relief, and it's funny the way he digs out the eyes. It's evidence of a living personality.
I think somebody used the word innocence. I think humility is a better word.
Yeah, right.
You know, there's a kind of just a sincerity, a humility.
And having been intimidated by, imagine working for Donatello, you would be humble after that.
He was in charge of the sculpture garden, which when Michelangelo was living with the Medici, and it's through Bertoldo that Michelangelo was introduced to all of this work. I mean, he was Michelangelo's mentor, as far as anyone knows.
When you look at this relief and you look at the pectoral muscles of the horses each one has a front view. It's quite amazing how he could take the same set, the same pieces, and change them into different patterns and different combinations, so that the front of every horse is really rather different. It looks at, he's got the same muscles which he takes all the way to almost a pure form, and then he changes that form or moves it around into a different form. But it's very something. It's something close to what modern sculptors might do.
Well, part of what I think is so appealing to us about this battle relief is that it's all over.
Yeah.
And that's something we're very accustomed to now.
Yeah.
Must have been pretty radical in the Quattrocento. A lot of bad things happen to horses in the lower part of that relief, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned the absence of depth in it, which also makes it feel very contemporary. I think the fact that it is so much about the present surface and not very much about an illusion of something happening in space.
I went back and I looked at some of the reliefs on the Camposanto in Pisa, the Roman reliefs on the sarcophagi there, and they also are quite serial, but they have more of a focal point to them than some of the Pisanos. Of course, the reliefs in Pistoia, Siena are quite serial also, but they also seem to have a slight bit of depth to them. And this one doesn't.
No, it's all
this one is
thrusting
just
at us.
right straight across and very even parts. Also, I mean serial parts in terms of the divisions. That's some of the complexity of this. The supplicant is a different kind of figure. than Saint Jerome. It's a different kind of figure than the man on the horseback in the other room. It's not linear at all. It's closer to the ones in the relief, I thought.
Yes, yes, it is. I loved that, though. I loved that little subject figure.
It's the kind of figure that we would be interested in modeling.
It's remarkable, I thought.
Maybe they're pointing back to that Gothic quality of Donatello, but they're also pointing ahead to Michelangelo.
Yes, yes, I thought that, particularly when I saw that hand. It's that arm and hand is quite wonderful, though, isn't it? I mean, it's so much more expressive, I'm sorry to say, than the Michelangelo David hand.
Yeah, and when they say that maybe Donatello do that, I'm not sure Donatello would have done that hand that's not resting on the thigh like that. That doesn't seem like a gesture he would have made.
Well, in the reproduction we're looking at in the catalogue, he's holding a staff of some kind, which would account for why the fingers and thumbs are placed the way they are, which without anything holding them, it makes it much more
That would be the same as the
interesting and yeah.
Well, we don't know the history of that either. I mean, you could see the patron saying, I have trouble with that hand. Give him something to hold. What about a cross?
Yes, anything's possible.
And something that I felt very strongly in the show is a sense of his making it up as he went along. This is, yes, Donatello has set the standard, but there's also, it's a wide open field. He's looking at all of this classic Greco-Roman stuff that gets dug up and adulated. And said, well, what can I do with this? Well, as I understand it, the Medici were the main client. So, and the frieze was for the exterior of the Poggioacano villa. So, but everybody did everything. You were. You need a little clay chachka, we can do that. So, you want a major devotional, what have you, fine. And most of them painted and sculpted. It was a full service operation. And Leonardo was flirting with sculpture all his life. Well, Renaissance contracts, you wonder how anybody ever did anything. If they specified the number of figures, whether it was going to be a half-length figure, full-length figure, and how much lapis lazuli you get to use on the Virgin's robe, and then some of them apparently end with, and if I don't like it, you'll change it.
Yeah, well, I mean, constraints can be very freeing, in a way, and we don't have enough of them today, perhaps.
There's something.
I mean, just thinking of we've gone from looking at Rachel Harrison to looking at this. It's quite a astonishing kind of. Can we consider them under the same umbrella? Really?
Well, yeah, but I think it's important to consider them under the same. That this show is a 21st century show, and available to us, though. It's available to me, and I feel very lucky to have access to this. I don't think it's as available to Rachel Harrison as it is to me, and that's too bad for Rachel.
I think, I don't mean to change the subject, but what interested me also in the show, which as somebody who casts things in bronze, were the different varieties of bronze. I happen to have heard that bronze casting is variable. What's handy to put in with the copper, that's what you put in. And some of these were high tins, some had zinc, and so on. And then the question of the patina was quite variable also. The one of Pegasus, for instance, looked like it had that deadly Renaissance black patina, which really, I find deadening. But this one we're looking at right here now is whether it came about this way naturally, or I doubt that it was ever painted, is a very, very thin, tasteful patina, very respectful of the bronze. And each one seemed to have a different response to the material at the end, which again attests to his individuality in the same face of each work.
This relief we're looking at now is just delightful, isn't it? Just delightful. The pleasure of looking at it is joyful.
I mean, we'll never see these works the way Quattrocento people saw them.
Yeah.
No matter how much research we do. We have a direct connection with the Rachel Harrisons, for better or worse, because we're coming out of the same context. Can we consider them the same way? Even if, I'm changing the subject, but even if you consider Rachel Harrison within the context she comes out of, which is modernist constructed sculpture, you can go back to Cubist collage. I find it wanting in those terms.
I think the shift after people like Franz West, for instance, to bad sculpture took it away from the criteria that guided sculpture for so long. That's my personal opinion, that was an earthquake, really, to intentionally de-accession classical criteria. When we look at Bertoldo, I think that anybody who thinks of sculpture through the eyes of the older criteria, now older criteria, will not be disappointed. The abstractions are all there that make sculpture compelling in and of itself, that have, in a sense, come down to be the definition of the content of sculpture. They're all there, they're all present. And I suspect they were very aware of these things, unless they were just riffing off the models, which were so good.
Were they articulating it? Probably not, but there's obviously a difference between the artists who had this strong sense of abstract formal composition, who were the ones we revere today.
Exactly.
Verisimilitude wasn't the only issue.
Yes, it's so interesting because unfortunately we don't have what these people said, but not long afterwards in historical terms we have what Leonardo said about proportion, about the concept of beauty, about the abstractions that go into producing a metaphysical result. I mean, it's all there in his little book.
Yeah.
Well, Alberti talks about that.
Alberti talks about it, yes.
Well, the Renaissance was a long time ago, and it was something that was sort of rejected at the beginning of the 20th century. Perspective was thrown out and so on, but it was never completely rejected.
Well, some people have considered the Renaissance the first modern art.
Well, sure.
That was when the individuality that Garth was speaking about, this feeling of the individual persona, adapting everything to their own innocence or naivete even sometimes. So if it is the first modern art, it's still present.
Yeah, well, it's alive in this show, and you've got Rachel Harrison and Franz West who are rejecting everything associated with it. There's also Kent Monkman, I think. Kent Monkman is across the street at the Met, who is engaging with or embracing Renaissance values without any understanding, sort of. And then there's Peter Agostini, who embraces the Renaissance with an understanding. It's a messy situation, but there's a vitality to this show of old stuff.
I think if we wanted to really grapple with these as they were made, I think we'd have to really know the content of the subject a bit more than I happen to know it. I think that the patron, as well as the artist, would have been thinking very hard about whether you were bringing to life the myth of Hercules or the myth of Pegasus. I mean, you really had to be pretty good at it. You couldn't. I think it would have been criticized as to how you represented these subjects.
But it's the content that they were, adjusting to the subject, and we're doing the same thing.
Well, we don't know that, Bruce. We don't know that. No, I mean, the patrons may have been open to some kind of, uncertainty, some ambiguity, some mystery. We don't know that they had a very precise and clear sense of how things should be presented or portrayed.
And it was a very elite group. I mean, the Medicis sponsored the Bronze David, which had to be kept behind closed gates when the public was out for the passeggiato in the evening. I mean, they were so sophisticated and such a small elite group in the entire world. I mean, this thing happened. Bertoldo was part of this immense piece of culture being born in a very small city, and not in any other small city, just that one small city in a very small group who all read the same poetry, read the same philosophy.
Well, you did have humanist courts. Certainly Urbino.
Yeah.
Which also produced in a microcosm a lot of extraordinary work.
Everybody was different too. It's not this one thing called the Renaissance. The Renaissance itself was about being born. It's about changing, dealing with things that are brand new and a sort of lack of permanence and so on. Time not too different from the time we're living in.
My sense as well is that it was a fairly competitive kind of atmosphere amongst the patrons and the artists.
There was also a lot more international exchange. I mean, Florence was full of bankers who were and wool merchants who were in Northern Europe. So there's a lot of, it was more wide-ranging than just that one city, but there was all kinds of stuff coming in there.
But the access that you mentioned, the digging up of Greco-Roman rule, I mean, that's Bertoldo had access to things that were part of his daily existence. Maybe that he could really bring one of these things maybe into the studio or something. Bring in a Gothic figure, a Greco-Roman figure. But if you look at the St. Jerome and you think of the proportions of a Gothic figure and you think of the proportions of a Greek sculptor working for the Romans, and you think of the proportions of a Romanesque sculpture, that particular sculpture is kind of an amalgam of different things. The legs look so Gothic to me.
Yeah.
If you just went by measurement, for instance.
Right.
Yeah, it's a combination, isn't it, of available models and imagination, and somehow or other melding things together differently each time.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful show, and I think raises questions about where we are today,